We've got Keith Preston back on the show. He's one of these uncategorizable people. He's not a conservative, he's not a libertarian, but he's very, very interesting and has great respect for what we stand for. Keith Preston is the editor-in-chief of the website Attack the System. He's the author of Attack the System, A New Anarchist Perspective for the 21st Century. His brand new book, it's called The Tyranny of the Politically Correct, Totalitarianism in the Postmodern Age. Keith, welcome back to the show.
Hello, Tom. Glad to be back.
I just told people about your book, gave them the full title. Let's start off by justifying your use of the very harsh word totalitarian. Are we not risking downplaying what life must have been like in Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany when we talk about the inconveniences of political correctness as being totalitarian?
Well, we have to understand a number of things when we talk about that question, and we have to understand that the term totalitarian can mean several different things. There's a such thing as soft totalitarianism and a such thing as hard totalitarianism. Now, currently what we have in the Western world is a form of soft totalitarianism. It's not hard totalitarianism of the type we would experience somewhere like North Korea or Stalinist Russia or Nazi Germany, but we do have a system where there is an effort to control every aspect of thought and speech and subordinate the entire character of the society to an ideology. Now, it's true that hasn't yet gotten to the point where we're sending people to labor camps and having firing squad executions and that kind of thing for political dissent. But we do see a paradigm emerging where there's an effort by the power elite and by institutions to subordinate every area of life to a particular ideological paradigm. And that is what I mean by totalitarianism.
Now, let's jump ahead a little bit because I want to talk about Herbert Marcuse. I want you to tell us who he was. I want to talk specifically about his essay, Repressive Tolerance, because it has an eerie ring to it these days.
Yeah, Repressive Tolerance was an essay that Herbert Marcuse wrote in the mid-1960s. He was an immigrant from Germany. Back in the 1950s and 1960s, he taught at a number of prominent academic institutions in the United States. And his essay, Repressive Tolerance, outlines this idea that in order to have true tolerance, you have to have repression, because you can't really have tolerance if points of view that are considered to be intolerant are allowed to be heard, or that beliefs and practices that are considered to be intolerant are allowed to be engaged in. So in order to have tolerance, you actually have to have a great deal of control over what people can and can't do, because otherwise someone might do something intolerant. Now, if you go and read that essay, Repressive Tolerance by Herbert Marcuse, and it's available online in different places, you see very specifically that what he is calling for is actual suppression of free speech, freedom of association, all of the traditional, classically Western liberal rights that took centuries to achieve, and by the centuries of struggle to achieve some of these things. He's advocating restricting these in the name of promoting tolerance. And as a manifestation of how that works, we see it today with things like hate speech laws, where you can be subject to economic sanctions or fired from your job or whatever for crossing the line of what is considered politically correct speech or politically incorrect speech. In some countries now, they have hate speech laws where you can actually be arrested for expressing politically incorrect views. Some European countries, you have situations where Christian or even Islamic clerics have been arrested for expressing some negative view of homosexuality or something of that nature. And that kind of thinking is becoming increasingly pervasive in Western institutions, both in the United States and in other Western liberal democratic nations. There was actually an interesting article about that in The Economist, the London Economist, just a few days ago, about how free speech is in decline all around the world. And in the West, the attacks on free speech are mostly being done in the name of promoting equality. You know, we can't say bad words about minorities, women, gays, the immigrants, the transgendered, anyone that's considered to have been discriminated against or disadvantaged in some way. The important thing to consider about this is that all of the things that Marcuse is advocating are now being put into practice in institutions where the hard left has achieved positions of power and influence. We see that most succinctly in the academic world. Whenever we see situations where you have a speaker, say, on a university campus who has less than PC views about this, that, or the other thing, and you see students rioting in protest of the presence of this particular speaker or throwing objects and things of that nature, or we see universities or other institutions canceling presentations by particular speakers on the grounds that they are offensive. I saw an example the other day where some particular university in California, it was declared heresy to refer to the United States as a land of opportunity.
America is the land of opportunity is, quote, offensive, according to the University of California system.
On the grounds that, well, people who fail in the United States might not think so, or someone that can't make it entirely on their own merits might be offended by that. I mean, and this is how petty and extreme this kind of thinking gets. But if you interact with the people who are zealous promoters of this philosophy, you see that they are 100% dead serious about this. Primarily, we see this kind of thing going on the university campuses in the United States. In Europe, it's a little more serious because these kinds of things are actually working their way into the state, and they're actually being legislated, and the power of the law is being put behind them. I've come across cases like the police in England gathering data about racist incidents on playgrounds among toddlers, or 11-year-olds actually being put in handcuffs because they referred to a Pakistani student by a derogatory, ethnic slur or something of that nature. So essentially what that is precisely what Marcuse was advocating, or at least the implication of what he says is that non-leftist, non-progressive, inegalitarian ideas, thought, speech, etc., should essentially be criminalized and banned from society entirely. This is precisely the kind of system that they had in the old Eastern European and Soviet systems. If you go back and you look at the actual constitutions of some of the Eastern European Marxist-Leninist regimes, like, say, Nicolae Ceausescu's Romania or Enver Hoxha's Albania, what you see is in their constitutions, they would say, well, of course, all citizens have the right of free speech and things like that, except, and then they'll list all of these exceptions, except for speech of a racist, nationalist, fascist, capitalist, religious, xenophobic, whatever variety. In other words, anything that's not communist. So you have the right to agree with the regime, and that's about it. And that is precisely the implication of what is being done in the West now, in the Western liberal democratic countries, with this political correctness or whatever we want to call it. It's an effort to essentially gear all of society's institutions and all of private life towards conformity to this particular ideology. The implicit assumption is that the ultimate human evil is to ever make any kind of differentiation or, God forbid, discrimination on the basis of race, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, immigration status, etc. And anyone that does anything like that, or even gives the appearance of doing anything like that, or even hints that they might someday do something like that, or expresses sympathy for people who would do something like that, that essentially should be banned from society entirely through the use of law and through the use of economic sanctions and through the use of institutional power of every conceivable kind. The reason that I am as critical of political correctness as I am is because this is precisely the kind of thing that has been done by the hard reactionary left in the past. A lot of times when people think of authoritarian, reactionary, repressive governments and regimes, they think of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and right-wing military dictatorships in Latin America and things of that nature. But historically, far-left regimes with a very statist and authoritarian orientation have been just as awful as anything you've seen from the right. Going back at least as far as the French Revolution, we see the French Revolution, which was supposed to be this revolution that was about liberation and overthrowing the oppression of the monarchy and the aristocracy and all of that, taking this turn where all of a sudden you have different radical groups that are sending each other to the guillotine and things of that nature. We saw the same thing in Russia in 1917, where you had the Tsar abdicated and a kind of provisional government was formed that was kind of a quasi-democracy, including everything from liberals all the way and constitutionalists all the way over to the anarchists and the Marxists and all of that. And then we saw a coup by the Bolshevik Party, who managed to get control of the army, who established a military dictatorship and instituted a type of military command economy. And I would argue that what is actually happening now with political correctness, what I call totalitarian humanism or whatever we want to call it, is another variation of that. This is another variation of authoritarian, reactionary, repressive ideology being pushed as somehow a means to liberation and progress and equality and all of these things. I think it's very similar, for example, to theocratic religious regimes, where you actually have restrictions on speech and religion and other things under the guise of blasphemy laws and laws that actually criminalize things like heresy and apostasy and things of that nature. For example, even today, if you go somewhere like Saudi Arabia, you find that. You find they have their own version of PC, and it's rooted in this particular Wahhabist interpretation of Islam. And if they can accuse you of blasphemy, they can take you out and flog you or behead you or something like that. And I would also say that the comparison to the 1950s in some ways is apt, because the left will make a big to-do about how we had the phenomena of McCarthyism and anti-communist hysteria, and and writers that may have at some point said something sympathetic to socialism were somehow accused of being agents of the Kremlin and all of that. Years ago, I had a friend of mine who had been involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement before it became fashionable in the early 1960s, like 1962. He was actually involved in anti-Vietnam War protest, and he said in those days it was physically dangerous to protest the war in Vietnam. You would have people would come out and beat you up and call you a commie and things like that. But I would say that that's exactly what the left is doing today. Now it's the left that's doing these kinds of things. In the mid-1960s, the left would say, well, we want free speech in the universities, and we want radical speakers to be able to speak on university campuses and people that oppose the war in Vietnam and things like that. Well, now the people of their ideological perspective actually control the university campuses. Well, they're doing the same things that their former opponents were doing. They're simply trying to censor and exclude points of view that don't conform to their ideological paradigm. And all of this is entirely predictable, from the point of view of basic social science theory. One of the core insights of conflict theory in sociology is that former outgroups, when they become powerful and fall into power, often become just as abusive as whatever it is they replaced, often more so. For example, I mentioned the Russian Revolution. When the Bolsheviks took over Russia, they actually took the remnants of the old Tsarist secret police and actually turned it into a secret police force of their own, and actually made it a lot more efficient and therefore more pervasive and more repressive. And we see that going on now on a more subtle level with this political correctness thing. We see exactly the things that the left said they were fighting against in the 1950s and the 1960s coming into full fruition now once again and being given a leftist ideological cover. If you look at the kinds of ideas that people like this have about actual state policy, forget the philosophy itself, but what do they actually advocate in terms of actual state policies? The implicit assumption is that all of society should be subordinated to this particular ideology, which in turn has to be enforced by the state. They generally have no regard whatsoever for the autonomy of civil society. They generally think that institutions like the family, just a place where children get abused and daughters get molested, men beat their wives and things like that. Religion, well, that's just a place where, people get brainwashed into believing in backward, unscientific superstition. Or a local community, well, that's just a place where racists and bigots and homophobes have free reign to exclude whomever they want to exclude. If you ever talk about things like political decentralization with some of these people, like the idea that political power should be dispersed among localities and regions, and there should be a balance of power between central governments and local governments and things of that nature, the first thing they will always invoke is Jim Crow and slavery. They will say, yeah, that's what Jim Crow was, or that's what slavery was. And that's what the whole idea of dispersing power in society actually means to them. So they don't have any regard for any principles of political decentralization. They don't have any regard for the autonomy of civil society. They don't particularly care for many of the liberal traditional rights if they think this gets in the way of social justice, like free speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association. And they will tell you freedom of association, that's just an excuse for racism. Freedom of religion, well, that's just an excuse to discriminate against gay people. Freedom of speech, that's just an excuse to vilify minorities and women.
So how do people get to attack the system?
You just go to the website, attackthesystem.com.